I wrote this book at this time because I was a little fed up with the pessimism I was seeing about Canada. There have been books down through the years which basically try to chronicle how we have regressed. That, you know, the golden age was the Pearson age, and since that time we've been in a kind of period of steady decline. And I don't actually believe that's true. And I try to bring out the assets Canada has. I start by talking about the size of the dog in the fight, and I conclude with the size of the fight in the dog being the most important characteristic. But you know, if you think about Canada as a country, we think of ourselves as small because we live next to the United States, but we're actually bigger than 160 other countries in the UN out of 192. Our economy ranks us at the moment about 11th in the world, and even in 50 years' time, when all of the emerging countries have emerged, we still will be in the top 15 countries in the world in terms of economy. In per capita income, we'll be probably 5th in the world. Our universities now rank us about 3rd in the world in terms of quality, according to a British study. Our high school students, according to another study, the PISA study, rank 3rd, 4th, and 7th in the world in terms of maths, physics, and reading comprehension. Our authors, I was Canadian ambassador in Germany, and I was often at the Frankfurt Book Fair, the world's biggest book fair. Our authors are in enormous demand. Our musicians are winning. Justin Bieber just won Artist of the Year in the American Music Awards. We've won more gold medals than anybody else ever did at a Winter Olympics. You know, we've just finished hosting the G8 and the G20. We're a country that can do things. The second reason I wrote the book was because I didn't think we were doing those things. Mm-hmm. I was dissatisfied with the foreign policy I've seen in recent years, particularly the current government, but not only the current government. There were steps taken under Chrétien and Martin and not taken, which I thought weakened our foreign policy. So I wanted to sort of say where we've been, where we are, and what we need to do to get back in the game. There are people who would like you to believe that it's not important. It became not important the moment we lost. You know, UN was portrayed as a collection of thugs and tyrants, and why should we want to be a member of that organization? The reality is that it's very important. It's the place where the world brings its biggest problems to be dealt with. I'm thinking of the 9/11. The U.S. came to the UN Security Council for authorization to use military action against Afghanistan, and it was granted. The U.S. and the U.K. came to the Security Council in 2003 for authorization to take military action against Iraq, and it wasn't granted. 2006, the Israelis and the Lebanese brought their war to the Security Council to sort of bring it to an end. Now it's the Security Council where the international community's response to the alleged Iranian nuclear weapons program is coordinated and conducted. One of these days, probably the North Korean issue is going to come back on the UN agenda. So it's where the big issues go to be dealt with. Sometimes they're resolved and sometimes they're not resolved, but that's a reflection of the international community. It's not a reflection on the UN. The other reason why it's important is that, you know, Germany, Japan, India, Brazil, South Africa are all trying to get permanent seats. These are significant countries. They're trying to get permanent seats on the UN Security Council. And they're doing that because they agree that this is the most important security table in the world. And they want to be present all of the time. When we lost the election, we lost the opportunity that comes to us only periodically to advance our interests, to put ourselves on display, to show the world what we can do, and to do some things which are in our interest. For example, there's a big overlap now between the G20 membership and the Security Council membership. We may well see in this period some efforts made to reform the UN. If we were there, we could lead that effort. And we could do it in such a way that would protected Canadian interests. As we're not there, we can only watch. Again, there are serious consequences. Well, for one thing, the obvious thing is that evidently some of the Africans who might otherwise have done so didn't vote for us in the UN Security Council vote. These are countries who care about development particularly, and we have effectively said, that we've removed 7 of the poorest countries in the world from our country of concentration in Africa, and we've added 5 countries who are less poor in Latin America. Maybe this is a sound policy from a Canadian perspective, I don't know, but it certainly does amount to downgrading Africa and the Africans. The second thing that we did to the Africans is that we reneged on our Kyoto undertakings. Both the Liberal governments under Chrétien and under Martin, and the Harper government have not. All of them have not carried through on the commitments we've made. And in fact, the Harper government basically washed its hands of the process and has kind of hitched its climate change policy to the American climate change policy. It's pathetic, actually. This is what George Shultz called, former U.S. Secretary of State, called light switch diplomacy, that when you have a change in government or a change in leadership, you have a different foreign policy. And other countries can't keep up with the changes, and they wonder why what seems to be very important one year turns out to be not important the next. So this is something a country like Canada, which is not a very big country, cannot really afford. You can't afford the incoherence and the inconsistency of policies where you're believing one thing one day and something else another day, and you're for something one day and you're against something, the same thing the next day. I think that Canadians, if they saw this in its if they saw the significance of it, and perhaps they do, would not be happy to learn that that we're regarded as a country that's sort of off again, on again, not very consistent, not very constructive at the UN these days, not playing a very large role internationally, not able to manage important relationships well. Thinking of the Mexican relationship, where we've done enormous harm to that relationship. We issued we made a decision that Mexicans would have to have visas to visit Canada, but we issued that decision on the eve of the travel season. 250,000 Mexicans were to be coming to Canada over the subsequent months. We didn't have any infrastructure in place in Mexico to hand out the visas. A whole lot of people, more than 100,000, I think, had to cancel their trips. It cost the Canadian travel industry scores, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And it left a very sour taste, a very bitter taste in the mouths of a lot of Mexicans. That's not a way to run a foreign policy. Mm-hmm. That's poor issue management, poor relationship management. One of them is on Afghanistan, and I'm happy to see the government is actually doing it, which is to say that I said that we can't, either we should not be in Afghanistan at all, in which case we should leave immediately, or if we think it's worth doing, then we should not be leaving on an arbitrarily established date. And I suggested that we stay and do training, and that's what's happening. But also there's the Israeli issue, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, where the government has become one-sided. It's become, previous Canadian governments have maintained policies which they called fair-minded, which did not mean even-handed, but it meant that they were prepared to look at the issues sort of as they saw them. And there's always been in Canada, all the way back to 1947, a strong disposition to support Israel's right to exist, and that's never really been in question. But never before have we been exclusively pro-Israeli, and have we been unwilling to see the Palestinian side of the issue, to understand the problems that are there for them, to recognize that they have legal rights. We've basically signed ourselves up to support whatever policy the Israeli government is following, because it's a democracy. Democracies shouldn't get such passes in international relations. So one of the things I'm saying is, let's base our foreign policy vis-a-vis the Middle East, first of all, on international law, That way we can be fair-minded and principled in fact as well as in rhetoric. And let's temper that with some compassion, because there are people on both sides who are suffering a lot. So let's try to stick to that kind of position and call them the way we see them. I'm quite happy to do that. But that might require us to say, for example, that when the government of Israel refuses to suspend the illegal construction of settlements in the West Bank, we should be opposing that. We should be saying something about that. We should be telling the Israelis that we don't agree with them. I don't think you're a good friend of Israel by going along with whatever they do, especially when in the longer run there's some question about whether the Israelis are creating a situation which is going to be almost unresolvable. And it's not me who's saying that. It's Israelis who are saying that. Even Prime Minister Olmert said that Israel has to come to grips with the Palestinians and the trade-off that's developing between being a Jewish state and being a democratic state. These are very serious matters, and the Canadian government needs to maintain its capacity to make its own judgments about these things, and not just take the view of another country because it's a democracy. We don't accept the American view on a lot of issues, and it considers itself the greatest democracy. That democracy sent Canadian citizens to be tortured in Syrian prisons. So, we shouldn't be giving democracies a pass just because they're democracies. And we shouldn't be giving sort of sentimental underdogs a pass just because they're sentimental underdogs. We should be judging what they do according to international law. And as I said, with a sort of a leavening of compassion for the people who are suffering. One of the things that, for example, another important issue is climate change, where I suggest, and another important issue is arms control and disarmament. There's room for NGOs, plenty of room for NGOs in both of those areas to be trying to develop public opinion in Canada in support of action by Canada in those areas. I think those are two that come immediately to mind. I was the head of our Kyoto delegation way back in the day, and I had on my delegation a number of NGOs, and they were invaluable at that time. They really helped a lot, both because they were quite expert in the subject matter, more than I was, and because they had relationships and connections back through Canadian society that were quite valuable in terms of ginning up support for things the government might need to be doing. Sometimes it's pressure and sometimes it's support. So I think that, and the same thing goes for arms control disarmament. One of the problems with arms control and disarmament is that there's nobody younger than me who seems to be worrying about it, and it is a very important issue. If you look at what's happening in the Korean Peninsula right now, this is really scary stuff. We have a leader there who's only semi-rational, I think, by our standards, with one of the most capable militaries in the world, at least conventionally, and perhaps with nuclear weapons, probably with nuclear weapons. This situation could get out of hand really fast, and it could have enormous consequences. This is the most heavily armed area on Earth. China with nuclear weapons, Russia nuclear weapons, Japan, the third or fourth biggest military capability in the world, the United States, the two Koreas. This could become a really big mess. So more effort on arms control and disarmament would be a great thing on the part of NGOs, as far as I'm concerned. Raising consciousness, trying to make it possible for people in government who want to do things to have some support, because it's easy enough to sit on the sidelines. The choice we have is to sit on the sidelines and watch the game to be played, or to decide that we can play this game and to go out and play it and to make a difference.